In the summer of 1909, a work crew was digging beneath the east lawn of the Breakers, the 70-room Newport mansion owned by the Vanderbilt family, when their shovels hit something that was not supposed to be there. Not a pipe, not a foundation stone, not buried treasure in any ordinary sense of the word. What they found was a sealed passage, pre-existing. Arching downward beneath the estate at an angle that led nowhere a Victorian drainage project would ever need to go. The foreman stopped work. A message was sent to the main house. Within hours, every man on that crew had been pulled off the site, paid out in cash, and made to sign a document whose contents were never publicly disclosed. The passage was sealed again before nightfall. The original work order was quietly amended, removing any reference to the discovery. And for the next several decades, the story of what happened under the east lawn of the Breakers existed only in fragments, passed down through the families of the men who were there. If you want to understand why that matters, you need to understand what Newport really was before the Gilded Age families arrived and decided it was their playground. Newport, Rhode Island, sits on a quidneck island at the mouth of Narragansett Bay. Today it is famous for its mansions, its sailing regattas, its summer crowds, but its geographic position has made it one of the most strategically significant landing points on the entire eastern seaboard. Deep water access, natural harbours, proximity to overland routes north and south. Whoever controlled Newport controlled the flow of goods, people and information up the Atlantic coast. The official history says Newport was founded in 1639 by a group of religious separatists from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in one narrow sense, that is accurate. But it is not the beginning of the story. It is not even close to the beginning. Because before the English settlers, there were the Dutch. Before the Dutch, there were explorers whose records were either destroyed or deliberately obscured. And before all of them, the landscape of Aquidneck Island bore unmistakable signs of habitation at a scale that no one has ever adequately explained. The stone walls that run through the forests and fields of Rhode Island have been explained away as colonial-era farm boundaries. Most of them probably are. But certain walls in the Newport area do not follow the logic of agricultural land division. They follow topographic contours in ways that suggest defensive positioning. They connect to natural high points. They enclose spaces that would have had no practical farming purpose, but significant strategic value. Researchers working in the Tartarian framework have identified Newport as one of a cluster of eastern seaboard sites that appear to have been retrofitted rather than built from scratch by European settlers. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The pattern is consistent. Settlers arrive, they find stone infrastructure already in place, they quietly incorporate it into their own construction, and within a generation the prior origin is attributed to the previous inhabitants who, conveniently, kept no written records that survived. This is the mechanism by which an entire prior civilization can be written out of official history without anyone needing to lie directly. You simply stop asking questions about who built what you are currently using. The old stone tower in Newport's Touro Park is the single most contested structure on the eastern seaboard. Standing roughly 9 meters tall, built of rough-cut stone and mortar, resting on 8 round arches, the tower has been attributed to everyone from Norse explorers to colonial governor Benedict Arnold to Phoenician traders. Carbon dating of mortar samples has produced dates that do not line up neatly with any of these explanations. The tower is cylindrical in a way that has no clear colonial precedent in New England construction. It is oriented with precision that aligns to astronomical events. It sits at the top of a low rise that would have been a navigation landmark for any ship approaching Newport Harbour from the south. And it sits at the approximate centre of a radial pattern that, when you extend the lines outward, passes through every major pre-colonial stone site on Aquidneck Island. One of those lines, extended southeast, passes directly through the property that would eventually become the Breakers. The Breakers as we know it was built in 1893, designed by Richard Morris Hunt for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, modelled on 16th century northern Italian palazzo architecture. The original structure on that site had burned in 1892. Before that, the property had changed hands several times since the mid-19th century, and before that the land had been part of a larger tract used for agricultural and maritime purposes going back to the earliest days of the colony. What no one talks about is what the land was before any of that. The cliffside position of the Breakers is not incidental. The estate sits on the cliff walk where Ochre Point meets the sea. The geology of that coastline is unusual. There are natural caves in the base of the cliffs below the estate. The rock formations show evidence of human modification that significantly predates European contact. The specific orientation of the property creates a natural acoustic and visual corridor facing due east, out over the open Atlantic. If you were building a reception and transmission facility, you would build it exactly where the Breakers stands. Now we return to 1909. The work being done that summer was a drainage project, an effort to address water intrusion in the lower levels of the estate's basement. The Breakers had an unusually deep foundation for a residential structure of its era. Hunt's design had called for subterranean service corridors and utility spaces that extended well below the normal frost line. Workers digging to improve drainage in the northeast corner of these lower spaces encountered what was initially described in surviving records as anomalous stonework. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The anomalous stonework turned out to be the entrance to a passage that ran beneath the estate at a downward angle toward the cliffs. The construction technique was not Gilded Age. It was not colonial. The stone was cut with a precision that the men doing the digging in 1909 were not equipped to replicate, even with the tools of their own time. The mortar, where mortar was used at all, had the colour and texture of material that had been in place for centuries. The ceiling of the passage was arched with the same technique found in the old stone tower, using a radius of curvature that produces superior load distribution, and would have required advanced geometric knowledge to achieve. The passage was approximately 2 meters tall and wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. It sloped downward at roughly 8 degrees, which over the distance involved would have brought it to a point level with the base of the coastal cliffs below the property. No one continued to the end of the passage. The foreman made that decision within the first day of the discovery. A message was sent. The Vanderbilt household dispatched an agent, not a family member, to assess the situation. The agent spent several hours below ground. He emerged and gave instructions. All work in that section stopped. The crew was assembled, paid, documented and released. A new crew, imported from outside Newport and given no context for their work, was brought in to seal the entrance. They were told they were reinforcing a structural weakness in the foundation. The surviving evidence for this event is fragmentary, but not absent. 3 sources need to be understood in combination. The first is an account preserved in the oral history of a Newport masonry family whose great-grandfather was among the original 1909 crew. The account was recorded in 1971 by a local historical society and has circulated in summary form among researchers since the early 2000s. The full recording has never been made publicly available. The second is a gap in the estate's construction and maintenance records that corresponds precisely to the summer of 1909. The Preservation Society of Newport County, which administers the Breakers, maintains a detailed archive of maintenance, renovation and alteration records going back to the original construction. That archive contains records immediately before and after a window of roughly 11 weeks in the summer of 1909. For those 11 weeks there is nothing. The third is a letter, referenced but not reproduced in a 1988 academic study of Newport's built environment, in which a member of the Vanderbilt household staff described an event that summer, using language that researchers have since cross-referenced with the oral history account. The original letter has not been located. The 1988 study cited a private collection. What was the passage for? The Tartarian model offers a coherent answer that the official archaeological record has not even attempted to provide, because the official record does not acknowledge that the passage exists. The civilization that researchers in this framework have identified as predating the current historical record was not primitive and not isolated. It used the landscape systematically. Coastal sites served specific functions, high ground structures coordinated with subsurface infrastructure, and passages connecting elevated positions to coastal access points appear at multiple sites along the Atlantic coast. Confirming them is made difficult by the consistent pattern of discovery, documentation, and suppression that has characterized encounters with this infrastructure for over 2 centuries. The passage under the breakers, if it ran to the cliffs as the geometry suggests, would have provided direct, sheltered, unobserved access from the interior of the land to the sea. In a military context, this is called a sally port. In a commercial context, this is called a smuggler's tunnel. But both of those explanations require someone to have built it for a purpose that fits within the current historical timeline. What if no one in the current historical timeline built it? The dimensions, the construction technique, the material, the orientation, and the connection to the broader pattern of pre-colonial infrastructure on Aquidneck Island all point in one direction. This passage was not built by colonial smugglers. It was not built by 19th century engineers hiding something beneath a wealthy family's estate. It predates all of them, and it connects to something. The cave systems in the cliffs below Ochre Point have been explored to various depths by divers and coastal researchers over the years. What has been noted consistently but never officially studied is that several of these caves show evidence of human alteration. Stone removed cleanly, surfaces that are too smooth for natural wave action, entry points that are shaped rather than eroded. If the passage under the breakers connects to this coastal cave system, then what you have is a complete infrastructure installation. Entry from the interior, sheltered passage through the cliff, access to the sea at a point that would have been invisible from the water unless you knew exactly where to look. This is consistent with what has been documented at other sites in the Tartarian research literature. The civilization that built this infrastructure was a maritime civilization of extraordinary capability. It built for longevity, it built at scale, and it built in ways that could be found again by those who knew what to look for. The Vanderbilts were not Tartarian researchers. They were a family that had more money than almost anyone alive in 1909, and they had learned through experience that certain kinds of attention were not worth inviting. When your foreman finds a pre-existing sealed passage beneath your 70-room mansion, and the passage clearly predates everything you thought you owned, the rational response depends entirely on what you believe the consequences of disclosure would be. The rational response was to seal it and say nothing. What is interesting is not that the Vanderbilts suppress the discovery. Wealthy families suppress inconvenient discoveries with striking regularity. What is interesting is that the discovery was made at all, and that enough traces of it survived to be reconstructed. 3 fragmentary sources, none of them conclusive on their own. But taken together, they are not nothing. They form a pattern consistent with every other instance in which pre-Columbian infrastructure has been encountered in the eastern United States and quietly removed from the public record. The pattern is not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense. It does not require a shadowy organization making coordinated decisions. It only requires individual actors at individual moments making the most locally rational choice, which is to not ask questions about things that would be expensive and complicated to answer. The result, accumulated across 2 centuries and dozens of sites, is a systematic absence in the official record. A record that tells us the eastern seaboard was an empty wilderness before European contact. A record that attributes every anomalous structure to indigenous peoples who left no stone tools consistent with the construction techniques, no organizational evidence consistent with the scale, and no cultural memory corroborating the attribution. The passage under the breakers is a detail, one data point in a much larger picture that is assembled slowly, site by site, discovery by discovery, suppressed record by suppressed record. But details matter, because a civilization cannot be erased completely. What it built remains under the foundations of what came after, under the lawns of estates built by families who thought they owned everything. Sometimes a drainage crew with shovels in the summer of 1909 finds out that no one owns what they think they own. And sometimes the foreman sends a message to the main house, and the silence that follows lasts for more than 100 years. That silence has lasted long enough.